What is education, and why is education important? Is it important? After all, what's the real purpose of getting educated about anything? We so frequently take education and the process for learning in general totally for granted. Not only that, but the ways in which we think. How we've gone about structuring our own consciousness itself has largely remained unchanged for a long, long time. So how do we literally change our minds? Can we reconfigure our own ways of thinking? And if so, how? Join Dr. Joseph Atman, the founder of one of the world's most revolutionary educational centers, Middletree, and award-winning broadcaster Tammy Trujillo for Educate Everyone, and explore the mysteries of our own consciousness and the education we implement in order for it to be what it is.
Our guest on this episode of Educate Everyone is Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon, Dean's Professor in Educational Equity at USC Rossier School of Education and the Director of the Center for Urban Education, which she founded in 1999. With a singular focus on increasing racial equity in higher education outcomes for students of color, she developed the Equity Scorecard, a process for using inquiry to drive changes in institutional practice and culture. Dr. Bensimon has published extensively about equity, organizational learning, practitioner inquiry, and change. Now here's Dr. Bensimon with Dr. Atman.
And thanks, Estella, for being here. Can you just tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
I was a faculty member, a university professor at the University of Southern California for many years, since 1995. And I was in the School of Education, the Rossier School of Education, where I taught a variety of courses, but primarily I taught qualitative research methods to PhD students. And in the early 2000s, I received a grant, an internal grant from the provost at USC. And the purpose of the grant was to develop work that would strengthen one of the missions of the university, which had to do with an urban education, not just education, but an urban perspective to use university knowledge and resources to understand better how cities and urban areas function. So I was successful in receiving that grant. And in fact, I was the only one to receive that grant that year. And I used the funds to establish the Center for Urban Education. The purpose of that center was to address the issue of racial inequality in higher education outcomes. This was the time when everybody was speaking about accountability indicators, and those accountability indicators did not address issues of racial equity. And so I dedicated myself to making that the focus of the center's work, and I can talk more about that as we go on. This center was quite successful, and during the pandemic, recently actually, I decided to retire from USC, and I have begun to close the work of the center because it's now being continued by many, many of my students who are in different universities, and also by the Center for Race and Equity at USC. So other than that, I have a personal story. You can probably hear from my accent that I am not a native English speaker. I came to the United States in 1962 at the age of 13, but my mother insisted that I was ready for high school. And so I went to high school, and the high school was not accustomed to having students from other countries and who spoke other languages. So it was a difficult time, and I'm telling you this because I know that you work with high school students. And when it came time to apply to college, my guidance counselor thought that I was not college material. And so I ended up applying only to one college. And I think that experience as a foreigner in that high school in many ways has informed the work that I ended up doing on racial equity at the Center for Urban Education and prior to that. Prior to becoming a faculty member, I worked for nonprofit community organizations in New Jersey. So all of my work, at least since I started working, has been in this area of advocacy for racial equity, although it has changed over time. One time advocacy was much more political. Now the way that I do it is much more academic. So that's more or less about me.
I'd love to hear more about the Center for Urban Research. It's common. Yet at the same time, you kind of look back on your professional life, and it's so frequently informed by who we are as people, of course, especially if you're lucky enough in academia, which is one of the great things about being in academia, is so often you're able to reflect out your own interests and put that out there and do that professionally, where, that's not always the case if doing some other jobs necessarily. So it's cool to hear that you maybe got to explore your own interests through your own personal journey itself, and then to sort of benefit others by doing the work that you did. And hopefully that made some, and that's still continuing to make some kind of impact on folks.
It's true. And I think that what I mentioned about my guidance counselor, thinking that I was not college material, in many ways influenced what I ended up doing at the Center for Urban Education. When I started at the Center for Urban Education, I used data in order for faculty members and others to notice patterns of racialization in their courses as well as in their programs. But what happened when I did that was that when they saw lower performance among, let's say, Black students or Latinx students, Asian American, Native American, they would typically attribute those differences in outcomes, particularly when compared to white students. They would attribute it to student deficiencies. They would make assumptions about minoritized students in the same way that my guidance counselor made assumptions about me because I was a Spanish speaker. So that informed the theory behind a lot of the work that we did at the center. We need to focus not on the deficits of students, but we need to focus on the deficits or the need for remediation among faculty. We were talking before with Tammy that she teaches at Northridge, which is a state university, and where the students are predominantly Latinx, as I recall, because it's a Hispanic serving institution, but the faculty are predominantly white, and they haven't been taught how to come out of that deficit-mindedness about minoritized students and acquire what I would call an equity-minded cognitive lens. So much of our work was in making faculty members aware of that through a variety of tools so that they would begin to develop more expertise on how to work effectively with students who are not like themselves. And that has been really the core work of the Center for Urban Education, to help not only faculty, but also leaders in institutions of higher education to become more race conscious and to become also more conscious of their own whiteness and how that is a barrier to success with students who are of different racial and ethnic groups. I mean, obviously, my early experiences were influential, but it was through my graduate studies and through my community work that I became more and more aware that issues of race and racism, that they're structural. It's an issue of structures and power distribution in institutions of higher education. So most faculty are not aware of that. You know, they think of themselves, like a lot of people, as being colorblind. And so our work was to make them color conscious using a variety of tools, which I'm happy to talk about, so that they would develop this awareness, not by a lecture, but by actually engaging themselves in an investigation of racialization in their own courses, in their own departments, and in their own institutions.
There's a lot there. I mean, when you say color conscious, the deficit mindedness of people's own whiteness, isn't that kind of driving a further divide amongst race? And so I assume your goal is to try and eradicate racism, and, you know, or the objective of all this is to try and get everybody just on the same page, right, and just treat it equally.
No, I don't think you can say we're going to treat everybody equally, because that is when you create more inequities. And so,
wait, hold on. You create more inequities by treating it equally?
Yes, because the frame that informs equality is a frame based on the white experience.
That makes a lot of assumptions, though, Estella. I mean, that makes a lot of assumptions. You're basing everything, predicating everything on a white experience. Is that not racist in and of itself?
No, I don't think so, because I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about whiteness.
What's the difference?
The difference is that if I was saying that white people are racist, it's one thing. But if I am saying that whiteness is an aspect of our culture, then that is different. And so, for example, when we have studied the way that leaders are hired, how they are judged, whether they are ready for a presidency, the criteria that are used are often criteria that would fit candidates who are white, not because they're white, but because they have acquired the credentials, for instance, of having credentials from institutions that are high prestige, judging candidates by criteria that show them to be well assimilated, for instance, who don't have accents. So that's what I mean by whiteness, that whiteness is our default, and it's all of us, including me. It's our default frame of reference. And so what I'm saying is, if you do that, then you are imposing a heavy tax on minoritized students, because they will always then be seen as deficient because they don't meet certain expectations of what it is to be, for instance, a good student. And so I would say that that is one of the biggest problems. So my work is not about equal opportunity as such, but it's more about how individuals who have the power to impact the lives of minoritized students can become more aware that, for instance, that they are themselves white, and therefore much of everything that they do, they measure by their experience as white individuals. And that does not work for minoritized students, or, to deal with racist issues. And, and I'm not trying to eradicate racism, because I think that racism is endemic to our society and to many other societies. So that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to develop what I said earlier, equity-mindedness among practitioners who have the power to influence the lives of students and also to influence their opportunities. The McKinsey funding that institutions of higher education have received is a really good example of funding that comes with no strings attached and that enables institutions of higher education to experiment and innovate, but by changing their practices. That's what I'm after. How do we change the ways in which we teach mathematics, for instance? How do we change the ways in which we offer student services? And how do we change the blindness that often makes us commit inequalities without intent? I realize that the way that I see these things is from a critical race perspective. When I started this work, our political environment was not like this. Lots of colleges that I work with, the presidents and their leaders realized that their students were heavily minoritized and that they needed to be more successful with them. So they welcomed the work that I was doing. Nowadays, the term equity, racial equity, it's essentially expunged. And many of the initiatives that related to minoritized students are being ended, they're being destroyed. I think that goes back to your concern that you expressed about being divisive when you focus on race. But the fact is, we have always focused on race, even when we don't mention it.
I think it's important to acknowledge that there are certain inequities, just in general.
There are many
society.
inequities.
Absolutely. To frame it as whiteness, doesn't that drive just a further wedge, though? I mean, there are so many words in the English language. And if you're talking about societal norms, why whiteness? Why not use another word? Why not use the cultural normative patterns or some other phrase? Why is it necessary to frame it as whiteness? Because doesn't that put people on the defensive? I know you just said that you're not necessarily trying for equity, but aren't you? It sounds like it's taking the interest of minorities, which is super important, and giving them a voice and trying to level the playing field. I think everyone is more or less for that. It's almost like if you're in a relationship with anybody or anything and bad things have occurred in that relationship, it's good to acknowledge them, and it's good to talk about why that wasn't the right thing to do. And then you got to move on. Why continue to hearken on things that occurred in the past if we're all ready to get beyond that?
I don't think we are ready to
we all know that. Really? I totally disagree. I couldn't disagree more. I think this kind of language sheds such a bad light on people. I don't think that inherently anyone wants to really necessarily be divided. I think people learn division. I mean, how do you learn division? By talking division, by introducing the concept of division. If we introduce the concept of unity and had that as the overarching way by which we taught and expressed and interacted with people and gave people ways by which to connect and be inclusive and be equitable and be all on the same page, wouldn't that be a better way to go? And again, we have to learn about the past, all the terrible things that have happened in human beings' past on all sides. White people have been enslaved.
Whites have not been enslaved to the extent that blacks have.
It's not a competition, right?
No, it's not a competition.
We're all human beings. We're all human beings. That's the point.
To bring that into the conversation that whites maybe have suffered as much is a way of derailing.
I'm not saying they've suffered as much. I'm saying saying that all people. Let's look at all people. Sure. Well, they have been, of course.
Yes.
Asian people have been enslaved. Think of any race. Everybody's been enslaved. I think it's so important to understand that this is a human problem. Right? That human beings in power take advantage of other human beings who are not. That's the real issue. And it can be framed in a number of different ways. But all of this really boils down to those in power taking advantage of those who are not. I think if we looked at that and really understood those dynamics, I think we would get further, there certainly is inequality, and there certainly are racial divides, and those are things that I think we all want to see eradicated by and large, more or less. I mean, I think if you polled people on the street, literally 99 out of 100, probably 100 out of 100 would say that they don't want any inequities amongst human beings.
Yes,
so
people will say that. Yeah. But they will not necessarily adopt the practices that would address that. Let me give you an example, since we have brought in the issue of whiteness. So one of the tools that
you brought in the issue of whiteness. Let's be clear, because your work brings in the issue of quote unquote whiteness. Your work does. I think that's something that people have to decide whether or not that's a good way to frame it. I think that's an important thing to call out and ask. Is that a good way to frame it? But go on.
Actually, many scholars...
That doesn't hold a lot of water. I think scholars get us into a lot of these issues, and I'm one of them. I'm not sure that we can rely on the work of scholars to be the representative voice for the majority of people, especially on these issues.
Let me just give you an example. We have created a variety of tools that are you a faculty member yourself?
I'm not, no. I was just wondering what that has to do with anything.
Well, I was going to give you an example. When we work with faculty, one of the tools that we use is what we call the gradebook mapping by race and ethnicity. And what we do is that, if you think about a gradebook, it has a column that has the names of the students. And then you can rate them in terms of attendance, submission of homework, grades in tests, and so on. So what we do is, instead of having the column with the names, we have the racial, ethnic identity of each student. And then we color code each of those criteria, like grades, attendance, and so forth. And we color code in terms of if students are absent, they have a certain number of absences, we may color code it in red, and so on. Well, that exercise actually increased the awareness of faculty in looking at their own grade books, that, first of all, that some of their assumptions were wrong. For instance, they thought that in one class, that the reason why Latinx students were performing below other students was because they were not coming to class. But in fact, they had perfect attendance. And what the issue was that they were not submitting the homework because either they didn't understand how to do the homework or they were apprehensive that they were not going to do it correctly. So that faculty member changed the way that homework was done, and he had amazing outcomes. He said the outcomes for his class for the Latinx students went from 45% to 85%. So what I'm speaking about is that if faculty members become aware of the ways in which their practices are not working equally, they can be changed. But higher education has not done a very good job of developing faculty expertise, competency in working effectively with minoritized students.
And we'll have more of our conversation with Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon on the next episode of Educate Everyone. And now, the Middle Tree Minute.
This is Kristen Hernandez, Middle Tree's executive assistant. The last moments of the day matter more than we realize. Try creating a calm, end-of-the-day routine that includes reflection, light reading, or journaling. This helps the brain organize information from the day and prepare itself for rest. Even 5 quiet minutes can make a difference. A peaceful close to the day supports better focus and learning tomorrow. And that's the Middle Tree Minute.
And now a quick look into Dr. Atman's book, A Philosophical War. Joe, we are starting to get deeper into this question of why. Now, why seems pretty simple, right? It's a little word, but it seems to go a whole heck of a lot deeper. What more is there to know?
Everything than why. If we can figure out the why of not just, as we kind of said last time, of not just everything, but anything, that will lead us to many more layers and depths of our comprehension of our own existence and the existence of phenomena of being, of consciousness itself. So it's why, no pun intended, it's why at the onset of this, we have and are paying so much attention to that question. Why? Because again, if we look at and understand what the question of why actually implies, well, if why has an answer, if that question of why has an answer, then it means that there was an intention behind it. And again, the consequence is so profound when we really start to unpack and examine it. And like you said, it seems like a really simple thing. Well, why? Well, because, right? You ask your parents, well, why? Well, because I said so. But there's always, in our argument here in a philosophical war, is any and everything that happens, all of it has a how, right? The question of how did that happen? Well, you trace, sort of cosmologically, step by step back, go back in time and you can kind of get to any sort of end point of anything that happens within phenomena, any evolution. You can sort of see the revolutions of the evolution, A to B to C to D to E. You get where we arrived at the end of the alphabet if you trace it back. But the why is a much larger mystery, and again is not as apparent on the surface because, as we'd also talked about previously, we give primacy, we give our fullest attention, generally speaking, to the how of things and to the way in which things unpack themselves in a physical reality, which again makes a ton of sense. We're physical beings, but we're also conscious beings. We're also beings with this relationship to this metaphysical world because of the fact that we're just continually struggling for survival itself, right, within the physical world, that we sometimes don't give as much attention to that metaphysical space that we could argue we actually inhabit at a larger and deeper level than this physical reality, this physical nature, this how of things. So I wanted to really look at here at the beginning as we're setting the stage, and we're still continuing to set the stage 30 some odd segments into this, right? Because this is such a giant thing to unpack. We really have to be so super, super prepared and comprehending of all the layers and depths and consequences thereof within all of these things. And this delineation and distinction between how and why becomes very, very significant when we start to understand that in order to really comprehend what phenomena, what being, what things that start to almost hearken into this mystical realm that some might identify that we're not quite going there, but you could easily draw a straight line between that kind of thought, that kind of pattern of thinking or speech people tend to sort of sway into when you start to talk about things that aren't necessarily always connected to a physical reality, this how, this mechanistic, this straight in front of us physical being and otherness that we encounter within the physical realm. When you start to stray away from that, people don't really know what that space is because it's not as immediately available. So they tend to start to, again, use words like mysticism and spirituality and all that. But when we unpack and look at this question of why, it starts to drift into maybe potentially answering some of those long sought questions that religion, spirituality, mysticism has sought to answer for such a long, long time.
Thank you for listening to Educate Everyone with Dr. Joseph Atman and Tammy Trujillo. Join us each week as we explore the inner workings of our own minds and the educational system which builds and supports it. Also, check out our website at middletree.org to see what opportunities Middletree's programs can offer you or your student. And join us on social media. If you have any questions you'd like Dr. Atman to answer, please leave them on a post or send us a message, and you may hear them answered on the next episode of Educate Everyone. Until then, thanks for tuning in.